Hello guys, this is Miss Beacon, principal of Cox Elementary, and I'm so excited to be continuing our summer read alouds, and Finding Goby, and I will be reading chapter 15. So I hope you'll listen along. The minute Dion announced that it really was Goby, the room exploded. Everyone had been excited and hopeful before. Now they were ecstatic. Everyone was screaming and shouting and slapping Dion on the back and hugging him and each other. It was very sweet, but it was also a bit overwhelming. Dion could only imagine how Goby felt about all the chaos around her. Members of the team kept coming over to take pictures with Dion and Goby. He let them, of course. It was the least he could do after all their efforts. But when the doctor came over, she went a step further and picked Goby up herself. She was a sweet lady, and Dion knew she loved dogs, but she must have touched Goby's bad hip by accident. The little dog let out a squeal, the first time Dion had ever heard her do that, and jumped right out of the doctor's arms and into Dion's. The doctor looked crushed. Sorry, Dion told her. She hurt her hip somehow. That's all. He cradled Goby in one arm and held out the other so that the doctor could hug him and take a picture with both of them. She was happy with that, and her smile quickly returned. But after that, Dion was careful not to let anyone else pick up Goby. He knew none of them meant any harm, but he wasn't about to risk anything happening to her again. It took almost an hour for people to calm down enough for Dion to think straight. Then he found Richard in the crowd. I want to talk to the man who found her, Dion told his friend. Richard nodded and gestured toward the man who had answered the door for them. That would be Mr. Ma, he explained, leading the way. Their host saw them and waited patiently for them to reach him. Thank you so much, Dion said as they were together. He held out his hand and Mr. Ma shook it. I can't tell you how much this means to me to have Goby back again. He waited as Richard translated, and Mr. Ma nodded and bowed. Can you tell me exactly what happened, though? I'd like to know the whole story. Mr. Ma nodded and started speaking in Chinese. He slowed down after a second, smiled, and started again, but more slowly. This way, Richard could translate more easily. My son and I went out for dinner, Mr. Ma explained. He pointed to a young man talking to Milan. My son was telling me about this girl he had seen earlier. That girl there. She was putting up posters. The posters were about a lost dog. Your dog. They were written in Chinese and Uyghur. But these posters had notes on them too. Dion glanced at Richard, who shook his head. Neither of them knew what the notes Mr. Ma meant. The notes were handwritten. Their host continued. He smiled. The girl wrote them herself. She was asking people not to throw away the posters. She said it was really sad that your dog was missing and that you had come all this way just to find her. My son was impressed. He thought that you were very dedicated and that she was very sweet. Milan was very sweet. Dion decided that he would have to thank her later. He had no idea she was adding her own message to the posters. But evidently it had worked, at least for Mr. Ma's son. We finished our dinner, Mr. Ma continued, and headed home. The restaurant is nearby, so we walked instead of driving. Halfway home, we saw what looked like an old wig by the side of the road. When we got closer, we could see that it was a little dog. She was curled up, asleep. He shook his head. My son said to me, "That's the same dog, Dad. I'm sure of it." I didn't believe him. All dogs look the same to me. But he was certain. He smiled. He made me wait there so I could make sure the dog didn't leave. And then he ran back to the restaurant, and he came back with one of the posters. Mr. Ma fidgeted a little. I still wasn't sure. They look similar, yes, but the same? Who knows? My son, though, he was convinced. He called the dog, who followed us home looking hungry and tired. She's a good girl. Someone laughed, and Dion glanced up from the couch where he sat. He hadn't realized that they had an audience. It seemed as though the entire room was listening to Mr. Ma's story. His son and Milan were standing right behind them, grinning. Mr. Ma's son nodded in agreement and reached down to pet Goby. She licked his hand. Their host continued the story. Once we were home, we gave her some water and food. Then my son called the number on the poster. He also took a picture of the dog and sent it. He laughed. You said it wasn't her. Dion remembered how he had dismissed the message. He felt a sharp pang. What if that had been the end of it? He would have never found her or realized how close he had come. It was as if Mr. Ma could read his mind. The homeowner patted Dion on the knee. My son did not agree. It's just a bad picture, he said. He took another one. Then he scanned in the poster. He sent the two of them together so you could see. This time you agreed. Except that I didn't, Dion thought. He felt so guilty about that. He still hadn't been convinced. It was Richard who had told Lu Xin to come get them and made him go. If not for his friends, he still would have missed her. He looked at Richard, who just smiled and shook his head. Dion knew then that his friend would never tell anyone how close they had come to not following up on the photo. It would be up to Dion if he wanted to reveal that. Dion appreciated his friend sticking up for him, but he was big enough to admit his own mistakes. Besides, it had all worked out in the end. They were here, and so was Gobi. Well, I can't thank you enough, Dion said finally. Richard translated, and Mr. Ma bowed. So did his son. Dion set Gobi down on the couch beside him. Then he rose to his feet and shook hands with both men again. I think it's time to go back to the hotel, he told Richard and Lu Xin. With Gobi? Lu Xin asked, and Richard translated. You can't. They won't let you. What? Dion stared at them both. What do you mean? Both looked sorry as Richard translated again. No hotel in the city would ever let you bring a dog inside. It just isn't done here. Too many people around here feel that dogs are unclean, remember? If they thought a hotel was letting dogs in, no one would ever go there again. It's too big a risk. Dion frowned. Really? He asked. He had forgotten about the local attitude toward dogs. He was so used to the search teams who all loved dogs. But after all of this, he continued. He looked down at Gobi. She had sniffed the couch, turned around, and then plopped down to sleep, just as he had gone back in their tent during the race. After all she's been through? Richard shook his head. They're right, he confirmed. Maybe you can try and talk to the manager and see if he'll let you, but I doubt it. I stay in hotels all over China, and I've never seen a dog in one. Dion checked his watch. It was after 11 at night. How had it gotten so late? Suddenly, he was exhausted. It had been a very busy and very emotional day. Lu Xin rested his hand on his shoulder. We should ask Mr. Ma to keep her here tonight, she suggested gently. Then you can buy all the things you need for her, like her leash and collar, food bowls, and a bed, and collect her tomorrow. Dion sighed. He knew she was probably right. He had no idea what to do now that he had actually found Gobi. He had never thought this far ahead. He would have talked to Kiki and started the process of bringing Gobi home, but between here and there he had no idea. He turned to Mr. Ma. I'm sorry to ask this after everything you've already done, he said, then waited as Richard translated. But would you be willing to let her stay here for tonight? I need to make arrangements. I can come back and collect her tomorrow. Mr. Ma bowed. It would be our pleasure, he replied. His son nodded as well. That made Dion feel a little better. At least he knew Gobi would be somewhere safe tonight. He turned to Gobi again. She was sound asleep and snoring softly. Every so often a paw would twitch, just as it had the night during the race. Dion had always thought she was dreaming about running, maybe even about running with him. Dion knelt down and ruffled her fur gently, careful not to wake her. I'm sorry, girl, he said softly. I've got to learn a lot about being your dad, haven't I? Her ear twitched in response, but she stayed asleep. It was hard to leave Gobi there, and Dion kept turning around to glance back at her on the couch. A part of him feared that if he let her out of his sight now, he would never see her again. But he told himself he was being silly. She was safe now. The Ma's would take good care of her tonight, and he would be back to get her tomorrow. That was all. Just one night. Richard still had to practically push him out of the door and into the car. Dion barely remembered the ride back to the hotel or stumbling inside and upstairs into his room. As soon as he was there, though, he called, "Lucia, we found her," he yelled, and the second she picked up, he let out a shout of pure joy. Dion could tell from the sound that she was crying. That was okay. So was he. I want you to think about if there's ever been a time that you've lost something and then just been overly excited when you found it again. And that's what I would like you to reflect on after chapter 15. And that's what you can put in the Padlet after listening to this chapter of Finding Goby. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And tune in for chapter 16 coming soon.